Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another educational video. My name is Bahamut, joined by Justing, and today we are talking all things tanking in Heroes of the Storm. And of course, Justing, are you ready to blow everyone's mind with your amazing tank tier list?
Yep, I sure am. This is the only tier list you should need to look at the tanks and their priorities in the draft.
We're not going to go through every single tank, but we are going to highlight a couple tanks within each tier, and of course you'll be able to see the entire tier list, and there'll be a link below in the description for this video. So let's immediately start talking about our tier 1 tanks, and of course we got to talk about one of my favorite tanks, Muradin. Why is he a tier 1 tank?
So Muradin, along with the other tanks in this tier, are all very diverse in your build options. You don't necessarily have to play just one playstyle when you pick him. Muradin is traditionally really good at jumping to the back line and popping Avatar and being really tanky, but if they have a bunch of things like Tychus, percent damage, things that kind of don't let that playstyle exist, you can also go for more of an assassin build with the Haymaker. And sort of that talent diversity is what really makes all of these tanks tier 1. You could pick any of them from first pick and really have no problem getting countered because you can always just pivot your build depending on what the enemy picks.
Speaking of talent diversity, another tank that I wanted to bring up in tier 1 is Diablo. I mean, he's not all just push the buttons, win the game. You got to definitely line things up. You got to have some mechanical prowess as well, but he definitely has a lot of diversity with his builds, especially with his heroics as well.
Yeah, we saw a lot from Bad Benny specifically during CCL, the damage build for Diablo. The fact that there's different playstyles, you can either play for a more aggressive, just doing a lot of damage, being really aggressive with the engage with the APOC, or you can play for a more passive approach with the fire build, where you can reduce the enemy's damage as well, which if you're against things like double support can be super strong also. So there's really no way to completely shut these heroes out, and that's the main reason that they get put in that tier 1.
Speaking of supports and healers, we've got a bit of an oddity here in our tier 1 as well. We have a Stukov. Why is Stukov a tier 1 tank?
So Stukov is a tier 1 tank because if you play double support, Stukov is kind of takes that tank role some of the time, and you can play him with the level 1, the active that puts the W on everybody. Having that option to be played as a support tank is really, really strong. Stukov, he kind of does the main tank role by himself. You've got the root at 13 if you are playing in that position, which is just about as good of CC as any of the tanks have. You have the silence puddle, which is more CC. You have the ult, which is, again, just if a tank had the slap ability, it would be just ridiculous. So although he's not a traditional tank, if you focus him and he has the active level 1, you kind of just get punished for that in double support. So in the context of double support, Stukov is an S tier tank for sure.
And speaking of double support, as we move into our tier 2 of tanks in this video, we do have kind of two different realms of tank for our tier 2. We were talking about this beforehand. We've got kind of our quote-unquote normal tanks, and we've also got our double support tanks. So could you break down what are these normal tanks in this tier 2 for us?
So the normal tanks would be Anubarak, Varian, and Stitches. Anubarak would just be... The only reason that Anubarak isn't in tier 1 is because he gets countered quite heavily by double support. The standard playstyle for Anubarak is to cocoon the healer or whoever can save you, and then look for a one-shot with the burrow and the impale. That's kind of the traditional playstyle for Anubarak, is to isolate one target and one-shot them while kind of removing their supporting hero with the cocoon, and double support sort of counters that. So if there's no double support, Anubarak is stronger, but in the context, because you could get countered, that's why I wouldn't put him in tier 1. The other ones, Varian and Stitches, just super, super strong tanks pretty much all the time, but you don't necessarily want to first pick them. If you first picked a Varian, you could have something that has a short cooldown cleanse to kind of ruin your taunt. And if you first pick a Stitches, you could have a lot of mobility on the enemy team. If they know that the Stitches hook is coming, it becomes a lot more difficult to pick it. So that's why these things are in tier 2 and not tier 1.
And then we've talked about the normal tanks for tier 2. What are these other tanks that we have here? Because, I mean, we've got Uther, Maiev, Cho, and Zul. I mean, how do they fit into this tier 2?
So these tanks are all tanks under the context of double support, which I would say is the other main way of playing the game. Maiev and Zul are kind of the traditional double support tanks, as they have a lot of CC. You have Zul's E, his Bone Prison, and you have Maiev with the pull and the cage, which is really good CC, but they also both have a ton of wave clear. So when you have these double support compositions, often you lack wave clear, and we touched on it a bit in the Medivh draft video, but having something like a Maiev or Azul that can clear the waves and also provide CC, and if it has double support, is just as tanky as a tank at surviving burst. That's kind of their role, and that's why they're in this tier 2. They're basically the best tanks to have if you have a double support comp. And Uther, well, he is a support. If you have Benediction at level 16 and you have Divine Storm, he does have the longest lockdown of any hero in the entire game. If you use your Benediction on your stun for 0.75, for another 0.75, and then for the 1.75 from D-Storm, it's the longest CC chain from one target in the game. So really strong. Still a tank in the context of double support. And Cho just gets enabled so heavily by double support, and we've shown a little bit in our Cho'Gall videos in the past how strong of a tank he can be with that upheaval with the tank build. And yeah, these heroes kind of stand, I'd say, above the rest in the entire tier list. Tier 1 and 2 are both really strong heroes, and the rest are a little bit more situational than this.
Well, let's start getting into some of those situational heroes. Let's dive into tier 3, which we've kind of described or labeled as kind of flex tanking for these tier 3 heroes that we're seeing.
Yeah, tier 3 heroes are kind of all situationally good. It's more of a later pick in the draft, or you wanted to pick something to have as a flex pick. All of these heroes, to some extent with the exception of Tyrael, can be kind of played as an offlaner. So from a draft perspective, it's really nice to be able to pick these and save, be able to flex to either pick up a tank or pick up an offlane later on in the draft. And it also can kind of do some mind games to the opponent. But things like Imperius, for example, Imperius is his special thing that he does is he has a lot of percent damage. So if the enemy team picked something like a Cho'Gall, you'd have the ability to both have the Kidnap ultimate if you wanted it, which removes 2 heroes, and you'd also have the option to have, or you'd have that percent damage from his level 1. It's really good into things like Diablo as well. Just being able to flex that is really strong. And then heroes like Yrel, you can have a composition where Yrel is your main tank, where you have a kind of just a peel-heavy composition. It's the same as ETC. ETC, if played in the optimal situation for him, is mostly just using his W to knock back everyone just permanently, and your team is just sort of kind of grinding away at the enemies. These are things that you don't necessarily early pick. You wouldn't prioritize these early, but there can be situations where these are just the strongest heroes to play in the draft situationally. And Tyrael, with like a Tracer for a dive comp, you would want Tyrael over some of the tanks in the higher tiers.
Yeah.
But these are just things that you wouldn't want to pick really early because you'd likely get counter-picked.
Well, there you go. That's a nice way to kind of summarize these tier 3 heroes. They're very situational, and sometimes they can be absolutely menacing, as we did see in CCL. Tyrael and Tracer great together, but it's not something you see in the 1-2 immediately. Definitely something later in that draft, as you had mentioned, a little bit more in that flex realm. As we continue into our tier 4 of heroes, our tier 4 for tanking in Heroes of the Storm, how would you kind of describe this tier 4 for these 4 heroes that we have in Mal'Ganis, Chen, Arthas, and Deathwing?
So these things are mega situational, but when they're good, they're very strong. Mal'Ganis is somewhat similar to Sonya in like 2015 era, when if they didn't have enough interrupts, the Sonya would sort of automatically win the game. I feel Mal'Ganis is kind of in a similar situation where if there isn't really any CC on the enemy team, Mal'Ganis is very, very strong. But even just one hero that really interrupts the way that he wants to play makes it quite difficult for him. So that's why he's only in tier 4. Chen is a really weird one, but there are situational kind of niche comps where you could play him as a main tank and get a lot of value if the enemy can't maybe stop a keg from engaging if there's no cleanse for it, or if they're playing double support and you want to reduce their spell power with his level 4. Arthas is really good into a lot of heavy dive, and Deathwing has some very weird niche situations where the enemy just doesn't have anything that can deal with him. And he has actually pretty good CC with his Fear at level 10 and the Earthbreaker, the stun that he has. Also being able to play him into things like Garrosh and just not be a target to be thrown in is really strong. So these are like mega niche heroes, but they still have a place situationally in the draft in the tier 4 slot.
A lot of control that you're seeing from tier 4. As we move into our final tier of tanks for Heroes of the Storm, we have got, well, a lot of offlaners, but we've got one tank that I really want to talk about, and I'm sure a lot of people are curious as to, Justin, why are we putting Mei in tier 5 for tanking?
So Mei is a good counter-engage tank, and I'd say in general, she sort of does what Johanna does a little bit worse than Johanna. She's very counter-engage focused. She's very slow, That's the main downside to her. While she does have some good combos she can do, she sort of needs someone else to set her up, which in the tank role, traditionally, that kind of affects your entire team comp. Normally, you have the tank being the first CC, the person who's engaging the fights, whereas Mei kind of plays more like a follow-up hero. She plays almost like a four-man, like a Gazlo in your four-man or something that's just following up on the tank. So if the Mei doesn't have something to set her up, then she gets a lot less value. So just in the way that the draft typically goes, Mei doesn't work so well. You can't just plug her in where a Murden would go, where a Murden can jump on him and stun them, and that sets up the fight. Mei's a lot slower. She sort of needs someone else to engage for her, or to be used exclusively for counter engage. So that's why I'd put her in tier 5. She's just a little bit too slow for what she does. Well, she does have some good control, and she does have some moments where she's pickable. Not something you'd want to pick early on by any means.
Now, really, just to wrap up this tier 5, we've got 4 solo laners in this category, Justing. I want to pick your brain as to why D.Va, Artanis, Hogger, and Dahaka are on this tank tier list as they're offlaners.
So they can all be played in that tank role depending on mostly the map and the rest of your team composition. Something that we saw a decent bit in earlier seasons on maps like Garden is we would see teams run 2 or 3 offlaners. If you have 2 offlaners, if one of your offlaners is your tank, you can kind of just have the top and bottom lane be completely just controlled by dominant solo laners, like the D.Va or like the Dahaka, like the Hogger. And being able to just kind of sit in a lane like that on both sides of the map gives you a lot of control, because it allows your 3-man to sort of just move freely between clearing mid and then going either top or bottom, no matter what's available, what camps are available. It sort of just gives you priority everywhere on the map. And so in those types of situations, there is a case to be made to have your tank be another solo laner like that on those big maps where you're spread out quite a bit. And you kind of, like if you have a Diablo in one of those situations instead of a Dahaka, you're going to be just constantly falling behind on the map if they have someone come and push your lane. And if you have a Sylvanas on the enemy team or something coming in and just pushing into your lane, if you're a Diablo, you're just standing there waiting. You're kind of just off the map for 30 seconds. But if your tank is a Dahaka in that situation, he can clear the wave just as fast as the Sylvanas and then dig top, and you can make a 5-man play top. So it's sort of more playing for the map than playing for what the specific role is with these tier 5s. But it's a very rare thing. It's not something that you do very often, and you'd have to kind of be drafting with that in mind.
And we've done a lot of draft videos in the past, and we'll do some in the future as well to break down. Maybe we'll do a draft video where it's, a tankless draft, how to do this sort of solo lane draft with these mass rotations and macro play. Maybe we'll break down that someday in the future. But of course, Justin, before we kind of wrap up this video, is there any sort of PSA? Is there any sort of tips that you can give to any of those tank players out there that just want to improve? Is there something that they should be looking for, prioritizing? Is it positioning? Is it communication?
So the tank role, in my opinion, is the hardest role, because you need to not only be focusing on what you're doing, but you also need to be focusing on your whole team's positioning. So you're paying attention to the enemy team's positioning and your own, because if you don't have anyone to follow up when you go in, then you can hit a 5-man mosh, but if no one's on your screen, on your team, then it's not a good mosh still, because there's just no one there to follow up. So as tempting as it is, you need to be able to pay attention to both what their team and your team is doing. And you also need to, something that, just as like a general tip, getting on your mount a lot as the tank is super valuable. People tend to kind of forget that you can use that just all the time in combat. As long as you haven't just gotten hit, you can get on your mount. So trying to permanently get that move speed buff and just staying out of vision as much as possible. If you're a Diablo, your team will appreciate it more if you're standing in the brush next to them, watching them clear the wave out of vision, than if you are auto-attacking the wave. So just staying out of vision, super important as well for the tank role.
Well, there you go. You've got a tank tier list to take a look at home, as well as you got some great tips here from Justing about how to improve your tanking. Be sure to check out other videos that Justing and I have done on draft theory, draft content, and even some fun games. You can check them right over here.